Hey, what's up, guys? I just wanted to make a very quick, off the cuff video sharing my thoughts and opinions on Naughty Dog's secret, unannounced game. Before I get into the justification of the video, which I will share a couple of clips of Neil Druckmann and then we'll hash them out, I just want to say that Naughty Dog has always been my favorite game developer, and I think one of the reasons for that is they basically introduced me to gaming. Back on the PS1, I have very fond memories of playing all the Crash Bandicoots that came out, and then the studio got a little bit better at storytelling with Jak and Daxter. And I got to experience that trilogy, as most of us did. If you were born in the early 90s to mid 90s, these were cultural phenomenons, these games. And it's what, propelled Naughty Dog to be, as successful as they are. This was the foundation. But what's crazy is if you were born back then, it's crazy how the studio, the maturity level of the studio was on pace with my maturity level. If you think about it, Crash Bandicoot, they were literally trying to compete with Mario, platformers like that. We saw that in the commercials that Sony had back in the day. But that was perfect for a kid my age. 10-ish years old. And then Jak and Daxter was funny. It was great platforming. It was like the epitome of gaming at the time. And again, I think if you were an adult back then, you probably dug Jak and Daxter because there was more storytelling, there was more dialogue, and there was humor. But it's just like the evolution of the studio. I grew alongside the studio because then Uncharted came out and it was rated teen. We're moving away from, the, rated E for everyone type content. And that was just mature enough for me at the time. I mean, I don't know. I think that was like my first or second year in high school. But, we had a lot of gunplay, and there were swear words, and there were, love stories, and there were all these sort of deeply complex, emotional things that progressed the story. Something that I would not have appreciated, around the time that Crash Bandicoot was out. So it's just crazy. And then they made their first M-rated title, 2013. I didn't, I kind of took a back seat with gaming around that time, but I discovered it a few years later, and The Last of Us is what brought me back into gaming, and has basically hooked me forever. I don't subscribe to these ideas that, the studio has changed for the worse, stuff like that. I'm trying to avoid certain words that describe the studio because I just don't want to go there. I don't believe the studio is regressing. That's maybe a solid way to put it. I feel like every single one of their games has been absolute bangers. And the way I see it is they're only getting better and better and better at storytelling. And at this point in my life, that's really what hooks me when I play video games. That's what I keep showing up for. That's what's worth my time. I like multiplayer a little bit, but, if I'm going to sink 30 plus hours into a single player game, I got to feel something. And Naughty Dog always delivers on that front. And I do think that Intergalactic is going to deliver. Neil says it's going to be the most gameplay heavy game that they've ever made, but then he also says that well, he hasn't come out and said it's going to be open world, but it's probably going to be open world, but we're not going to lose, you know, the cutscenes and the cinematography and however they want to intertwine this really emotional story. And we also know that it has, you know, deep religious, you know, meanings in there. It's so, but I think the religion is made up. But it's going to make you contemplate the meaning of life. That's what I'm telling you about. So, all right, that's enough of that. Let's get into something Neil said here.
One of my favorite things about my job is that I get to spin so many different plates. Sometimes too many, and one falls to the floor. So I try to limit those moments in time. But I enjoy being in the thick of it, like being like in the weeds, like directing this episodes, and that gives me a certain level of joy. And then I enjoy being very high level and giving support to other people, like Craig Mazin, my partner in the show, and you know, knowing that he would do things differently than I, but that is the beauty of working with him, is I get to be surprised with another artist playing in this playground that we've created with the video game. Likewise, I get the joy of, you know, we have several directors on Intergalactic. I work with 2 game directors, Matthew Gallant and Kurt Marganow. I have a co-writer in Claire Carey on Intergalactic. So there's times where I'm away and they are in charge. I get to come back and be surprised and enjoy with certain choices they made, and certain other ones I pull my hair out and we have to change course or argue about it. And I'm convinced that I'm wrong. And then, you know, there's another game that's being worked at Naughty Dog where I'm more of a producer role, and I get to mentor and watch this other team and give feedback and be like the executive in the room. I enjoy all those roles, and the fact that I jump between one to the next, it makes my job very exciting.
All right, so let's get into what he said at the tail end of that clip, which is, you know, he basically, Neil goes on these business trips where he will be the director on The Last of Us, the HBO show. And then there's 2 other directors back home at the studio in Los Angeles, and they're working on Intergalactic. He comes back and he's like, what the hell happened here? This isn't anything like what we talked about. And then he goes into the other room, and he's just like this overseer where he is the producer, and he just eavesdrops on everyone's conversations and then deals with it from there, right? Well, so, you know, YouTube is like sort of my main form of, you know, where I consume content. I don't really have Twitter, X, and all these other places where you can see what the insiders are saying. So I'm just sort of gonna talk about what I've seen through some of my favorite YouTubers here. And it's just this idea that it can't be The Last of Us Part 3 because he's a producer. And if The Last of Us Part 3 was truly in development, even though we do have some credible sources that have suggested in the not too distant past that Part 3 has been in development since 2022, you know, sorry, getting off on a side tangent, but if you go back to, you know, The Last of Us Part 2 documentary that came out, that made headlines, right? Because at the very end, Neil was like, you know, it took me a while to come up with a concept, but I think I have one. And then everyone was like, all right, so for sure we're getting Part 3. That's one of 2 of the unannounced games, because we learned that they do have 2 games in development after they canceled Factions 2 in 23 or whatever it was.
I did some other interview where someone asked me about The Last of Us and would there be any more stories or something, and I mentioned, like, you know, we have written a story that takes place after Last of Us 2 that stars Tommy, and I hope one day we get to make it. And the headlines across the industry were like, Naughty Dog has outlined Last of Us Part 3, and that's actually wrong. it was always a small story. It was never like a full title. At the time, we had higher priorities at Naughty Dog. Was like to fix our pipeline, to fix work-life balance issues. Just based on where we were, I didn't want to prioritize this story, so that story was shelved. And I still believe one day it will see the light of day. I don't know if it'll be a game or a show, TBD. First game had such a clean concept of like the unconditional love a parent feels for their child. The second one, once we landed on this idea of the pursuit of justice at any cost, justice for the ones you love, it felt like, oh, there's a clean concept here, and there's a through line from the first game about love. If we never get to do it again, this is a fine ending point. And right, last bite of the apple, the story's done. The great thing about working at Naughty Dog is that we don't have to. It's always like, we would love another Last of Us, but if you guys feel like are passionate about something else, we'll support this other thing. Very privileged position to be in. I never take that for granted. I've been just thinking about, okay, is there a concept there? And for now years, I haven't been able to find that concept. But recently that's changed. And I don't have a story, but I do have that concept that to me is as exciting as one, as exciting as two, is its own thing, and yet has this through line for all three. So it does feel like there's probably one more chapter to the story.
Well, if it can't be The Last of Us Part 3, because Neil's a producer, I want to debunk that right now. This is my opinion. And I want to use the word biased, even though I'm not, because I have nothing to do with the games, really, other than just being a mega fan like a bunch of you out there. It's wishful thinking is what it is. I don't think it's bias. Here's why. I do think it's The Last of Us Part 3. Couple of reasons. One, if it's because it's his baby, therefore he can't be a producer, because he would never be a producer on something that he created, his baby. Well, you know, and from the other things that we've seen, you know, I don't want to call him a narcissist or control freak or anything like that. I just think that he wants to have number one say in what happens with The Last of Us, because he certainly wants a certain direction to go in to wrap up the story, but he was also, you know, that was his first director role back in 2013 when the game came out. Anyways, well, what happens to babies? Well, they grow up, first of all, and the game came out in 2013, so that was 12 years ago, because it's 2025. You know, the game is in the freaking Video Game Hall of Fame. It's been recreated twice, the remaster and the remake. It's been out for a long time, over a decade, okay? That baby is hitting puberty. That baby is a teenager, almost. That baby is about to get a permit to eventually get a driver's license. And by the time this new game comes out, presumably Part 3, it would be, you know, how long? A couple of years, right? So by that time, the baby is graduating from high school. What do you do when babies graduate from high school? You set them free. You let them go. And I think, so two things. Either he's lying and he is the director, because we've seen Neil do that in the past. And I was going to pull up, you know, the trailer from The Last of Us Part 2 when they were starting to market the game. And it was that part where Joel shows up in Hillcrest, when actually it was Jesse in the game.
hell are you doing here?
You think I'd let you do this on your own?
So, but that was really controversial. There was a lot of pushback. It certainly led the fans into thinking that the story was going to be something that it was not. That was one example of when he lied big time. I remember when the first game came out. I certainly remember, watching all sorts of content surrounding the development of this game after I played it for the first time, and he lied to the press about is it going to be a dual protagonist game, that being part 1. People thought the whole time it was just going to be Joel, because he wanted to leave an element of surprise in there when you did take over and start playing as Ellie. So we've definitely seen him mislead the fans before, and I'm torn of whether or not I think he's lying, or he could be a producer and it's still part 3, but he's just taking a lesser role because there's been little nuggets in part 2, the video game, where you can pick up those cards. You know what I'm talking about? Throughout, they were spread. There's a collectible in the game, and they were what seems like lore pieces for what is going to be an intergalactic. There were like little robots on there on some of them. If you look down the art on the walls, there were like dragons and spaceships, like the whole like cow sucking up into the UFO. You know what I'm talking about? The big spotlight comes down, the cow gets sucked up. There were art like that. There was art like that in the rundown homes that you would scavenge in part 2. So that just like in Uncharted, in part 3, Uncharted 3, there was right after the fight scene or whatever in the beginning of the game, in the bar. The bar is the same. The bar was in part Last of Us Part 1 from Uncharted. And then there was a newspaper on the bar, I think, and it showed, there was an outbreak, and so they were teasing The Last of Us in Uncharted 3. And I think we were being teased for Intergalactic in part 2. There was evidence of that. And so it's, I think, entirely possible that, Neil wants to focus on Intergalactic because that's his new baby. That's his second child. He's starting a family, and that's a huge game. It's taking up a bunch of his time along with what he's doing at HBO. And so, there have been other directors that have worked and writers that have worked on both Last of Us games, but specifically part 2. They know where, Neil wants the story to go. They've worked with Neil a bunch for years now, over a decade in some cases. He probably doesn't need to be there 100% of the time. He probably has people that he trusts, that he can pawn this game off to, and he can just, like you said, be a producer. But, so real quickly, because I know we're getting long in the tooth here, and I don't really want to edit this down a whole bunch. There's these ideas that it could be an Uncharted game, or it could be Jak and Daxter. First of all, it's not going to be Jak and Daxter. They tried that in 2009, and it turned into The Last of Us. If you don't know much about that, there's plenty of, evidence out there, interviews and stuff you can look up and look all that stuff up. So it's not that. Uncharted. And then there was that post online by Nate the Hater or whatever, where he kind of, maybe it was that person, I'm not sure. I'm just spitballing here off the top of the head, but someone asked if this was going to be, a shorter game, and Nate the Hater or something like that responded, no. So that means it's not going to be a full-blown new Uncharted game, but perhaps it's a remake of the first one, because we've heard rumors about that, Uncharted 1 remake. That's entirely possible. Or it could be a new IP, right? Well, the way I see it is there's a 33.3% chance, because if you take, 100 and you divide it by 3, you'll get 33.333, which accumulates to like 99%, okay? So this is how I will break it down. Here's a pie chart. I don't think I'm going to give you a picture for this. I'm just going to explain it. There's a 33% chance that it could be The Last of Us Part 3. There's a 33% chance that it could be, what I would say, if it is Uncharted, probably a remake of the first game. That would be my guess. There's a 33% chance that it could be an entirely new IP. And then there's a 1% chance that it's either, I guess Jak and Daxter, which it's not. But maybe, like, I guess an Uncharted spin-off, or maybe even like a smaller Last of Us game. Nobody has really talked about that yet, because we have heard Neil say, well, not Neil, but we've heard insiders say that Part 3 is going to be a story that revolves around Tommy and Ellie, and mainly just those two characters. So, Abby might be in it, but she's going to be sort of off in the background somewhere. And whether or not they're going to split it between half with Ellie, half with Tommy, or is it going to be similar to the Part 1 where they kind of finish the job together? I don't know. But I just wanted to, I guess, clear the air, if you want to call it that, put my 2 cents out there and just say that it's a 33% chance that it could be any one of those three. Where I'm leaning is, I think Neil's lying a little bit because he wants you to focus on Intergalactic. I think it's The Last of Us Part 3. Like I said, I can't call it bias because I haven't been involved with the game at all. I'm just a fan. It is wishful thinking, and I hope that's what it is. I'm so sorry to keep you here. For those of you who have stayed for the entire duration of the conversation, thank you so much for your time. I just have one more thing to say, which is overnight I finished up listening to, I have to click over and look at it. I think it's the Sacred Symbols Plus podcast by Last Stand Media. Colin Moriarty recently interviewed Neil Druckmann, and Colin was hammering him about, the future of the HBO show and what could a season 4 last. But I don't think season 4 has been renewed yet. Season 3 has. We kind of know what's going to happen there, with basically being an entirely new cast, because it's going to be an Abby show for season 3. Neil said that he meant what he said in the documentary at the very end, which I already showed you in this video. So I don't know if that's further proof that The Last of Us Part 3 is in development. A part of me wants to believe that Naughty Dog, they're just acting like top secret agents with The Last of Us Part 3, because they do not want information getting out there. They do not want any leaks. They're not taking any chances with that. I know a lot. There was some vulnerability because in 2020, they were working. They let their employees work from home, and in that documentary, Part 2, they were talking about how that's not something that they were willing to do in the past, but given the circumstance, they make changes, they make accommodations, given the circumstances. And so maybe has something to do with that. Maybe it is Part 3 that's in development, but we're just never going to hear about it because they're just not going to take any more chances. So we'll see. They knew how long Intergalactic would take to develop. I also think, Sony had this live service initiative, and they were working on Factions 2, and for whatever reason, they just thought it wouldn't do well, or maybe they thought it wouldn't do justice. Maybe they thought, if we're going to continue with The Last of Us, it has to be another single-player game because this just isn't what we do here. Even though a lot of people loved factions, and people have theorized that they're not just going to throw everything that they did with Factions 2 into the garbage can. There's probably going to be some type of multiplayer component to Part 3 if it ever comes. And even if it doesn't, there was a story element to Factions 2 they might just implement into Part 3 story. And maybe that's what it was. Maybe they're like, you know what? Maybe the multiplayer was too story focused. Because there's such a single-player studio, they're like, we're just going to put this into Part 3, but maybe it's on the back burner. Because maybe there's corporate pressure for them to move on and sort of refresh things. Because maybe it has something to do with the controversy surrounding the second game. Although, I wouldn't actually believe that, because why would we get an HBO show then? Why would it win Game of the Year? Why would it have all these accolades? There's a lot of people who didn't like it, but there was a lot of people who did. There's a lot of people out there. So, anyways, I just thought I'd throw that in there. Go listen to that recent interview. It was that one amongst a few other interviews. Whenever that Neil has recently done, whenever something actually does get done. Neil does a lot of interviews, and you can sort of read between the lines there. So, anyways, I drug this out another 4 minutes. I don't even know if it was completely necessary, but I did it anyways. Thanks for watching. See you in the next one.